What is the biggest difference between coaching individual sport athletes and team sport athletes, especially as a strength and conditioning coach? Now, this is a unique question because, like everything, it depends on context. If there's one thing hopefully you guys are getting from these videos, it's that context is everything. Now, let's look broad real quick because it's never as simple as team versus individual or this black and white approach. We also have to consider the culture or region of the athlete that you're coaching or working with. You have to consider age. You have to consider, are you working with an individual sport athlete that also plays a team sport, or a team sport athlete that also is an individual sport? For example, in high school, some of you might have played baseball and American football, which are both obviously team sports, but then you might have also wrestled, which is largely an individual sport, even though, of course, you are representing your high school as a bigger team. I know I played baseball and American football, both team sports, as I just alluded to, but I also boxed competitively in college. That was an individual sport. So the reason I say this, before we even get into the other nuances, is you have to understand the history of the athlete that you're working with as well. Because maybe you get them later in their career, maybe you're working with a world-class discus thrower, that's an individual sport, and you think, okay, this is an individual sport athlete, but at some point they very likely played team sports. So what I'm saying here is you do not want to treat these like entirely separate organisms. Will there be differences? Absolutely. Let's say we're in the weight room right now if we're working in individual sports, like swimming and diving, right? I worked with divers when I was a graduate assistant at Southern Illinois. I also worked with men's and women's tennis. I also worked with team sports like American football and basketball and all these things. By and large, I didn't see that many differences in personality. Now, I said this is contextual. Can we see tendencies for somebody that maybe has played individual sport their entire life to be a little bit more analytical, to be maybe a little bit more introverted, to be a little bit more of that technician archetype? Sure. But can you isolate it to the fact that they're an individual sport athlete? What if they're an only child? What if that's the way that they've been? What if they were homeschooled, right? How far does this rabbit hole go? So I think that's what you've got to look at. You've got to look at this whole social continuum of, is it just the fact that they're individual or team sport, or is it otherwise? Now, I do notice that in team sports, when you're coaching them, when we have a team dynamic in the weight room and you're coaching, there's different logistical things that you have to be aware of as well. These people are used to working in groups. So socially, you may see a little bit more of a dynamic environment. People are going to chat a bit more. They're going to, because they always have to foster as this or work as this singular organism. Some of my divers were a little bit more reserved, but when I got them one-on-one, they certainly weren't introverted. So I think you have to be careful with that. And this is from somebody that, again, I work predominantly with American football, but also combat sport athletes. And so I guess my opinion on this, if we're looking at it overall, is aside from the logistics and how you manage the weight room and some programming nuances we'll talk about, from a social side, I don't look at them as all that different. I think that the only differences you're going to see are going to be dependent on that individual, their perspective, and I think that they expand way, way, way beyond whether that person is just an individual athlete or a team sport athlete. You cannot fit personality into that narrow of a vacuum. You've got to know more about them because it could be where they come from. It could be if they're an only child. It could be their upbringing at home. Could be cultural differences, all those things. Now let's talk about the program design element. By and large, athletes that play a team sport can tend to need a little bit more specialized programming. I'll go back to my discus example. I was fortunate enough to work with an Olympian discus thrower. Now, I was terrified. I was very young at the time. I didn't know a lot about the sport, so I had to do a lot of research into it. But this individual needed attention on him at all times. He was such a technician that he felt like if I didn't watch or correct every single thing in the weight room, that there was going to be an issue. So there's a difference logistically. He did not want anybody else to train in his group, which was a little problematic because in the place I worked at the time, we only did group training. We didn't do one-on-one. So we had to make sure that we felt like he was always getting the individualized attention he needed. You literally could not miss a rep. But at the same time, we needed to facilitate an environment that was friendly to that group dynamic. Now, how did we do that? Of course, guys, like anything, it comes down to managing perception. You have to get to know what he or she, but he in this case, wanted specific instruction on. I saw at the beginning, he would try to test me. he'd see, was his knee was it bent too much on this RDL? Was the bar path close enough on this snatch? But once he knew that I was locked in and I wasn't going to let any little slip in technique get by, he started to relax a little bit. See, what you see is these athletes will test you. They will test you to see, are you paying attention to me like I pay attention to me? And once you reaffirm that and show them that, you have this little bit of leeway where now, after maybe coaching his first and second and third rep on the snatch, I could leave him during his rest period and then address the other athletes. And, this may seem really easy to some of you because maybe you have 3, 4, 5 assistants, or maybe you have a bunch of other interns. But some of you that it's just you, it can get tricky because you've got to earn their respect, earn their trust, but then facilitate the other part of the group. Now, another piece from the programming standpoint is, where is this athlete in terms of their development? Because it's not just about whether they're an individual sport athlete or a team sport athlete, it's what training age they have. Are they still in this general prep phase where they just need to get stronger and work on some of these things? That was the case with diving. I couldn't do highly specialized methods because so many of them were so weak because they don't really have to push against the ground, right? When they're swimming, they'll have to push against the wall, but they're in a completely different environment from a gravity standpoint than, say, a sprinter who's got to apply force immediately. Well, when I'm working with this Olympic discus thrower, now I have to say that this guy is at the peak of his strength levels. So now I had to incorporate a little bit more specialized training. We're throwing implements that are a little bit heavier or the same weight as or a little bit lighter as the discus. We're doing a wide variety of other activities where, he's so strong already in the foundational lifts, such as the squats and the deadlifts and the cleans. We've got to look at other variants. Is that adding bands? Is that adding chains? But again, you're seeing common tie-ins that you're going to have to do that in the team dynamic as well. When I'm working with American football, I have somebody that's super strong. You're also going to have to incorporate these things. So what I'm telling you is a lot of times we get caught up way too much on team sport, individual sport. While there are certain nuances that you're going to have to address, their perception, how much attention am I getting? Do I want to work in another group? Do I want to be coached individually? Really, it still comes down to your understanding of the person as a whole, the background, the context, what you can deliver, and what their definition of great coaching is. So don't get too confused. Just make sure that you approach every session knowing the wants, the needs, the struggles, and the realities of that athlete and the situation. Give it your best. Feel free to disagree with this. There are some folks out there that have only worked with individual or team sports their entire life. I want to hear your perspective, but as somebody that's worked with both and competed in both, I'll tell you this, at the end of the day, all I wanted was great coaching. I didn't need to feel like I was special. I didn't worry about being in too big of groups. But of course, as we've learned, that's me. Sound off below. Can't wait to hear from you guys. This was learning the difference between coaching individual and team-based athletes.